Okay. So we're good. You can see this?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what we're going to do is we're just going to show you how to basically render one surface as something that is porous using something called an alpha channel. There's many different ways in which you can use alpha channels. You can build your own just in Illustrator or in Photoshop, or there are some that are just actually come packaged into with V-Ray and Rhino. But basically what an alpha channel does, or how it works, is it produces a gradient from black to white, from transparent to opaque. So the more black something is, the more transparent it is. The more white something is, the more opaque it is. The example we use today will just have black and white. So the black holes will basically render as a perforated mesh, and the white stuff will render as solid. You can also invert those things, but it also can be a gradient as well. So this is just one demonstration of that. So there's a couple of different ways in which you can do this, but I think sort of best practice way to do this in V-Ray for Rhino is to start with the material. So in this file, I have basically a wall, which we want to maintain as a sort of monolithic solid thing. It actually has a hole cut out, simulating something like a window, or maybe there's glass there. And then we've got this thing in front that's a screen, and they've been broken down already into two layers. We have the wall and we have the screen, and then you can see here we've already applied two V-Ray materials to those things, which we've talked about in the past. But right now, if we render this out in V-Ray, we can see that that wall doesn't have any perforations in it yet. It's still just rendering as a kind of solid and monolithic object with no transparency or translucency through it. And what we want to do is we want to apply something that'll simulate this as if it has a series of sort of circular perforated holes. So the way to do that is if we go into our asset editor, and you can see here under the materials tab, I've already got my screen and my wall material. The wall material that's been applied to that solid thing is just sort of mid-tone gray, and I've made the screen a sort of much lighter, almost white gray. And what we want to do is we want to apply what's called an alpha channel to this this material, such that it renders it at least parts of it as translucent. So the best way to do that is if you pop out this over here, which is the sort of layered material associated with the screen, and we want to expand this opacity part. So we want to click this and open it up, and you can immediately see here that we can change the opacity of this simply just by sliding this slider, and we'll see that the material updates, and that's just making the entire material slightly less translucent. But what we want to do is we only want to make parts of it basically transparent and parts of it opaque. And the way to do that is to apply an alpha channel or a black or white image to this map over here. And we've done some of this before, and some of the stuff we talked about when we talked about texture mapping. But basically the way that we get that started is we click on the check button, and then we click on this square, and it opens up a menu that allows us to apply all kinds of either sort of ready-made images that will apply texture maps. So for instance, if we just wanted to make it a checkerboard, which basically looks like this, if we then go back, and you can see here that it's being rendered now with every other thing being a checkerboard. So if we close this and click render now, what we'll end up with is something that is sort of just in the way in which that checkerboard was. We can see through part of it where the black is on the checkerboard. It's still opaque where the white part of the checkerboard is. And so you can see that gray wall behind this in this image, okay? And there's lots of different ways in which we might edit this. But the best way to do that is actually to go into Rhino and change the texture mapping properties, which is something that we discussed also in a previous class. And those are properties that are not embedded in the material, they're embedded in the surface that the material is applied to. So what we want to do with that is we want to select the surface, which already has the material applied to it. we want to go under the Properties tab, and then we want to click on the Texture Mapping tab. And the things that we're going to focus on changing here are this stuff down here, the UVW offset, which will move it based on a UVW, which is basically the internal coordinate system for this surface. U and V being similar to X and Y, W being like the Z axis. And what we want to do is we want to repeat this thing if we want to make it more denser by changing the UVW repeat. So let's say we want to make it more checkerboards. We could turn this to something like a 10 by 10 grid, and it'll just repeat that one texture map 10 times. So now once we've changed this and we press render, we can see now that by changing that, we've made this a much denser grid. So it's the same texture map applied to the material. We're just repeating the number of times that it's actually working on, actually repeating the number of times that it's sort of arrayed across the surface. And so you can see now that it's basically a 10 by 10 by 10 or 10 by 10 grid of that initial image of the texture map. What we can also do with this though is we don't need to just accept the sort of the preset checkerboards or other patterns. We can build our own patterns and apply them with a kind of knowledge of the size of this thing already. So this wall in sort of Rhino scale is 30 feet by 10 feet. And so I pre-built my own texture map. I made this in Illustrator and then just saved it out as a PNG file, which is a file that I've also included and emailed with you all earlier. And we can use these custom maps and apply them to images, materials, and V-Ray as well. So we could generate this so that it could be any number of things. This is just a sort of default perforated pattern. But we could also change this in ways where gray would become less translucent, or it might have some sort of gradient or some other effect that we're interested in. But when we apply that to this material, you can see that basically because it's already been sized, that it'll sort of snap to the ends much easier. So the way that we do that is we go back into our material editor, and we want to go back under the opacity map, and we're going to click here, and then we're going to click on this little menu button, which will bring us back to the menu. And what we want to select now is not the checker, which is what we had before. We want to select bitmap, which is going to allow us to then select and apply our custom made image onto that surface. So I click bitmap, it'll bring up, allow me to select a file. And Alpha 1 is that alpha channel that I've uploaded on Box and also emailed to all of you. And that's the thing that I just showed you that we generated in Illustrator. So I'm going to click on that, open that up. And we can see it here, it's stretched because it's sort of stretching it to the confines of a box, but we've already tuned it to the sort of dimensions of the wall on the outside. So now when we go back and it updates the preview of this, you can see the little circles here. So now it's being rendered as something more like a kind of circular perforated pattern. And if we go in here, click on this, and we're going to want to change back the UVW repeat to just 1, because we want that thing not to repeat 10 times. We just want it to repeat once across the surface. So now when we press render, we can see that those circles are here and it snapped to the thing. But there's a kind of funny thing that's happened here. As it turns out, the orientation of our UV mapping on the surface is sort of 90 degrees from what we want it to be. And we can see this is stretched. So actually what we want this to do is to be rotated so it looks like this across the surface, not sort of rotated and squished. And the way that we do that is we go back into the texture mapping properties, and instead of focusing on where the repeat is, we want to look at where we can rotate this so that it'll sort of turn 90 degrees and snap the other way. So we need to reselect the surface. We're already in our sort of texture mapping things. And while U and V are the sort of X and Y on this surface, and so they'll tell us like how it moves things in a way sort of along the surface and in sort of plane with the surface. this kind of like Z dimension, or the perpendicular vector that comes off the surface, that's the W. And what we want to do is we actually want to rotate this texture map 90 degrees in the W dimension. And what that will do is it should rotate this now 90 degrees. So when we re-render it, now we can see that it's exactly the dimensions that we wanted to, okay? And because it's those proportions, if we wanted to double it or change it, again, what we could do is we could stop this rendering, go over here, select this, over to texture mapping, and then maybe we can like make this go sort of to a scale of basically repeat 3 times in the U direction and 3 times in the V direction. So when we render it now, we get something that's much denser. But because we've already designed it for those proportions, we know now that it fits, and it'll continue to scale longer and longer. You don't always need to sort of size and dimension these things to every single wall. There's all kinds of other ways in which you can box and texture map things, and I encourage you to explore it. You'll get different effects. But this is just one very, very simple way to basically build something that looks like it has a perforated screen without actually having to go out and deal with like all of the sort of time it would take your computer to punch out all of these holes. Amy, was that clear? Okay. So I'm going to pause this one and we'll start the next one.